So, hi, you're all very welcome to another LinkedIn Live with the ADHD Advocate as part of our ADHD Awareness Month. It's been a really busy month and so many topics that we've covered every day from work, college, school, relationships, and how ADHD shows up in all of those. So if you have missed a particular topic that you're interested in, please do go and just take a look on the ADHD Advocate LinkedIn, and we'll also be posting all of these live events up onto our website as well. So to say, I'm Yvonne Duggan. I am one of the ADHD Advocate coaches, and I'm joined here by Susan McKay. And Susan is a neurodiversity changemaker, catalyst, and coach for what I think is going to be a really great discussion on an area that we both very much relate to, which is masking in ADHD in girls and women. So also just to mention, if you do have any questions or comments, we may not get to them today, but please do put them into the comment box. And we're going to have a special LinkedIn live question and answer session on November 1st, where we're going to be answering all of the questions that have been that we have taken and fielded over the month and all the various topics. So I think that's going to be a great event. So really looking forward to that. So please do send your comments in or your questions and we'll deal with that. So I just thought before maybe Susan and myself get into chatting that it just might be useful to actually just set out what it is that we're talking about with ADHD masking, what that is. And so it was our understanding of masking is that it's essentially about conforming and hiding behaviors to conform to societal norms. For ADHDers, that tends to be, I guess, neurotypical standards and conforming to them so that to avoid shame or stigma or struggles to avoid criticism, judgment, or being treated differently. What I do think is really important here, just to point out, is that there is a distinction that masking isn't necessarily a bad thing. Everybody masks to some extent, and we could call masking coping strategies. And so everybody has coping strategies in all sorts of scenarios and environments and areas of their life. And that can be very good and powerful and really help us in all sorts of different settings. And it is a normal part of, I guess, wanting to belong and fit in. And as Russell Barkley says, one person's masking is another person's coping strategy. So I think that's important to say that masking is sometimes, particularly when we see so much online and TikTok and all sorts of information flying around, as though masking is wrong. Masking's not wrong. However, when we get to talk about ADHD, it is about the intensity and frequency and how much it can impair us within our life that actually, I guess, is why we really need to start paying attention to it. There is very little research on the topic, and without doubt, ADHDers have far more coping strategies to mask or hide, struggles consciously or unconsciously. And I think that's something we're really, myself and Susan are going to chat about now. So there's far higher frequency of having to put coping strategies into place than perhaps neurotypical brains just by virtue of of the ADHD traits that show up. Um, so I guess whatever we call it, masking, coping strategies, it's far more prevalent for ADHDers. So Susan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank
Susan,
you.
I
Yeah.
haven't really introduced you properly yet, but Susan, let me just say, I feel is such an amazing role model for living and thriving with ADHD, even when you didn't know you had it. And I'm just going to say a little bit about Susan and then let's get into the chat. Um, Susan, you have had an amazing career. You are a woman who I think is just a powerhouse. You've been a senior leader and communication specialist. You've rolled out a part of, that rollout team for the global vaccine program for COVID. Certainly no easy task. You chair forums on global leadership topics with ministers. I've seen you in action and you are really quite phenomenal. And so much of this you have done as an undiagnosed ADHD adult. And I think you very much, and I think this is what we're going to get into, that this has been the heart of your success, and perhaps not knowing has been some of it can could be attributed to your success, but also the darker side, the tougher side of ADHD and coping strategies or masking that you would have had to put into play. So thank you very much. I've spoken enough. Over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Yvonne. Yeah, I mean, as someone diagnosed in my early 50s, yeah, I navigated most of my career with absolutely no idea that my brain was different or that my brain somehow was a category in the manual of psychiatric disorders. So that came as a bit of a shock. But in a sense, I think many of us, and when we get together and share experiences, I think many of us, we had a hunch that maybe we perhaps were different or didn't always fit in, just always felt like a little bit of a square peg in a round hole. And so, yeah, there definitely, I think the journey that I've had in the last 3 or 4 years to really come to terms and really own my new identity. It does feel in some ways like taking off a mask, which I think now I don't particularly, I realize I don't want, now I've got to the point where I don't really want to put it back, all of it back on. Now I've discovered who I am. So yeah, it's definitely, but the huge toll in terms of energy and self-esteem and all of these issues. So yeah, an interesting topic to discuss.
Absolutely. And, it's from our conversations, I think what has always stood out for me is that how ADHD, you would now, when you reflect back, now knowing you had ADHD, perhaps is at the heart of your success and the
Mm.
opportunities you were able to take on. Um, but also, on the other side as well, that left you very vulnerable. Would you like to share just a little bit of your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, when I was diagnosed, and obviously anyone going through a diagnosis is that's quite a sort of lengthy, involved process. And in those discussions with the clinician, I mean, when they gave me the diagnosis, which by then wasn't really a surprise because I fit the description pretty much perfectly. But what they said, it's not just that you managed to, learn to manage your ADHD, you actually harnessed it for your success. And so I think my story is important in the sense of when I emerged from it, I realized that all my the things I'm happiest and proudest of are as a result of the way my brain is wired. So that has been, I think, a great route to healing and sort of being able to give myself some forgiveness for really, obviously, I think it's really tough, sort of discovering something like this. For me, it wasn't a gradual realization. It was something that came up suddenly, which may not be the normal situation of it, but just the pandemic, the overload, the stress, there were stresses at work which were just building up and stresses that went beyond, me having ADHD. But in the midst of it, I was someone who very much does take responsibility for things. And when people were kind of screaming at me, "You don't listen, you don't pay attention," I thought, yeah, they might have a point. And certainly by that stage, I was so exhausted and so overstretched and overloaded that my ability to focus was, yeah, it was not great. And I was definitely struggling with prioritization, etc. So when, of course, I read something that put all of this into some kind of sense, I kind of went, "Yeah, that's me." But it was a shock because as I say, it came on. I mean, it was literally, having this kind of feedback and then reading something and going, "Oh my goodness me, everything in my life
Mm.
makes sense." And for me, I think the biggest toll was really on the health front. So it actually made a lot of mysteries that people had not been able to piece together. It actually, everything started to fall into place. It was like the missing jigsaw puzzle piece.
And if we go back into your career, where you felt that it was having ADHD without knowing it and the coping strategies you put in place, You mentioned to me about how that actually was a source of so much opportunity for you because you were so open to taking on more and more and more things, and that energy that you have as an ADHD person, you could take on all of these things. But then the other side of that is I guess, the negatives of so many coping strategies, right? Of just people pleasing, taking on more and more, the perfectionism, really, going that extra mile, and the expectations that from people that, well, Susan can do it because look at all that she does do.
Mm.
Um, and they are, I guess, they're the ugly side of so many coping strategies
Yeah.
out there.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it's the great Ned Hallowell who says that as an adult, the only treatment that you really need is to find the right job and to find the right partner. And I think maybe my luck has been, being able to find both. So I was always someone who loved learning, and so every stage of my life, whether it was in the primary school, right up to sort of uni, and I was at music college, and I found my way into the UN. So I I've lucky that my brain is super hyperactive. And so it's never ever, it just never stops. And I think as soon as we started to get phones in our hands with computers on them, my brain has, the idea of being bored is a long distant childhood memory, I think. And even then I was pretty creative. So I could always find things to make mischief with. So, you know,
I'm amused by just the expanse of your career from going into music college, because I also know you were doing some, producer at the BBC, and then you just found your way from music college to the UN. Right? That
yeah.
is
No,
that is like a true proper ADHD dear, right?
yeah, no, but it's so bizarre. I mean, I actually, I ended up when I was at the BBC, I ended up getting an opportunity to go on an assignment to Mongolia to start a radio project, and I think it was meant for somebody else, but they turned it down, and there I was suddenly in the frame. But the reason that I applied for it was because my ADHD, I got bored and I needed to go restless, and I left the office and went marauding and picked up the magazine, saw the advert. So I remember that, there's so many twists and turns in my story that actually it is the way my brain is wired. And even the way I met my husband, that was so funny because I'm dyspraxic and dyscalculic as well. And I'm very forgetful. My short-term memory is shocking sometimes. And I was on my way to Mongolia, and I was in Beijing airport, and I arrived at tons of bags because I was going for the winter and it was minus 30 degrees, and I had all these clothes and things. So I, on my way, I lost my bag. I left one of the bags on the left luggage. So the following night, I spent a night in a hotel in Beijing, and the following day I got there and I had to navigate lost luggage. I mean, I'm always losing things. And because I'd lost my bag, I eventually found the bag and I raced to the check-in because I was nearly late the time it took. This was back in late 90s. And nobody spoke English and everything was difficult. Beijing, I've never been in China before. And I get to the check-in queue and I'm standing next to this guy, and my bag was covered in all kinds of string and labels and whatever. And I'm wrestling with this, trying to get into some organization to get into the queue. And this really kind guy standing next to me sort of says, "Can I help?" And he produced a penknife and helped me with the string and all that. And yeah, 12 years after that, I married him. So I think
Good.
I think often the chaos and it's terrible to lose things. I do it all the time, and it infuriates people. Infuriates me, and I always feel embarrassed about it. But I realize that some of these encounters have actually, been the key to success or an opportunity. And I think probably the wiring of my brain that just seizes opportunity, it hates boredom, so it's, constantly restless and is, quite, I think if I was fitter, I would probably, jump out of airplanes and things like that. It's sometimes, just taking a leap of faith or just rolling the dice, I think
And
opened up
it can be such a blessing at the same time. And
curse.
this is where we see, with I guess with masking, for people, it's with ADHD, some of the most frustrating parts is that they are so simple. It is just the small things. It is the losing things, the forgetting, the time, the organizing, all those things that people that ADHDers look to other people. Well, they're able to do that. So what's wrong with me that I can't? And it becomes, for some, it can really become this very internal negative dialogue. And where they turn that inner critic becomes very, very harsh, internally. For many it can, and for some with masking, then it's trying to hide that to the outside world. And what we do know there's very little research on women and masking, and the extent of the coping strategies. What we do know is that women very often will be more, align themselves with people who are much more dominant, much stronger, much of where they can see the real, I guess, role modeled those, things in place of where people are together. They're super organized, they're super on time, and then that becomes, this is where we're supposed to be, and really trying to achieve that. But the problem is the disconnect internally that then happens for people, that
Yeah.
they then kind of lose sense of kind of who they are. What is amazing for you, and this is where I think it's really interesting, is that, your ADHD played such a really important role in what you achieved and who you are. Then the downsides of it, um, in some, it was, I guess, it counterbalanced some of those negatives that were there.
Yeah, I mean, I was just as you're talking, I haven't really thought of it this way before, but I found myself by taking that leap of faith and that kind of adventurous part of your brain that says, "Hey, let's mix it up, let's go on an adventure." I think, and I was very fortunate. I'm adopted, which is not an unusual thing for ADHD. There's quite a few link. There's an interesting discussion there, but I had wonderfully supportive adopted parents, and they'd certainly given me the confidence to sort of take opportunities. And I was Scottish, but I went and took my first job in London, and just that thing. And I remember it, and I suppose I wouldn't necessarily have put my the fears and concerns that I had or the anxiety that I had, I wouldn't necessarily have labeled it as ADHD, but I might have said, well, I'm a Scot and going to England, and the just sort of being from a minority part of the country to going to the big city, going to the big smoke. If I had those feelings, I probably just, interpreted or understood them that way. And
Mm.
then when I went, I would take a leap of faith and get on a plane and go to Mongolia. Um, Interestingly, again, I wouldn't have said, oh, well, if I'm struggling with this or finding it difficult, it's because I've got ADHD. I was doing, oh, well, it's because I'm a Scottish girl suddenly going and running a project in Mongolia. So I probably was actually reasonably kind to myself in the sense of I realized the enormity. And so maybe that's where the ADHD was, it was lucky because also in those situations, other humans are quite forgiving. Like, when you go and well, I remember when I was pitched up in Nepal to do a project, and it was very funny to them. They couldn't understand why I was unmarried. Um, but also the fact that I was so different was allowable, that I could be different. So, I escaped the kind of, I mean, I had hilarious conversations and actually ended up working in social and behavioral change because I was so fascinated and so curious about it. But actually going as a misfit probably allowed me to compensate for my ADHD. And most people don't get that, that kind of pass.
Exactly. And that's, as you said, with with Ned Hallowell, it's actually about environment is absolutely crucial. And so the environment was allowed a kindness for you.
Well, yeah, it could forgive me, but I think this is another important point, is so many ADHDers tend to, like, when we have a weakness that is getting in the way of something we want to do, it often means that we don't just compensate for that weakness, but we sometimes go on and turn it into an outstanding strength. And I've seen that in many ADHDers, and so that I would, I hate this discussion about deficit and disorder because, I absolutely reject that. I absolutely now believe, I mean, definitely trying to cope in a system that is not designed for the way you are is tough. And I think that that's fine. But I think the problem is that when you label it as deficit and disorder, then the problem is you. But I think what we're talking about really is environments. And maybe that's something that I've learned along the way, that, in the right environment, I think everyone can thrive. And so it's the lack of inclusive environments, it's the lack of openness to diversity of people being different. And I think, where I've seen everything I've learned along the way is that, when there is kindness and empathy and compassion and just respect and dignity, we can thrive. And so in some ways, I'm proud to be an ADHDer because I think, if you can make an environment work for an ADHDer, it pretty much works for everyone. I think that's my point. We're all so different, but if you can design environments for those that are least suited to them, you're just designing an environment where people embrace humans as they are and not as somehow there is some kind of model.
Absolutely. And that's where, that environment is absolutely crucial because what so many people that, the ADHD advocate that we meet who are coming for coaching really are coming from the darker side of that and are coming from environments that haven't been helpful for them. And so very often they're putting in place the coping strategies, and I guess and have experienced the damage from so many of the coping strategies of where, they can overcompensate by working harder, working longer. Um, and that is detrimental to their health, their family relationships, their romantic relationships. It can be really, really damaging. And I know that this was something that while the environment was always right for you, this is something that you did experience as well, is that, you're
Mm.
taking on more and more and more because you can, you should, you're able to, but perhaps not entirely. It's a Ferrari brain with absolutely no brakes, and it just keeps going and going.
Yeah, I mean, I checked myself in this month about, like, because I have written about my story, um, that obviously I feel incredibly grateful. I always did well at school. I can learn things quickly and I can pivot and I can be very flexible. The downside for me is that no, these environments have not always been good for me, and definitely um, some environments have actually been quite damaging. And so there have been moments where, yes, I have developed some damage and injuries from that. But what I would say is that luckily the other side, which is
Mhm.
constantly looking for improvement, I'm somebody who has a brain wiring that's very much looking at a kind of, I seem to be relentlessly problem solving and trying to improve things. And that essentially has helped balance the harder
Mhm.
things, because I think I've shown an ability to bounce back. And, once in the right environment, I can let things go. And I think that's something that resilience is something that we can develop. But in a sense, I think, you know, I mean, as coaches, we love working with clients and we love helping them in the journey um, to take off those masks, and also we help them with strategies to fit into environments. But I hope we also help people make choices because and we also I want us to do as much time as I spent on the working with individuals and helping them understand, manage, and be really proud and just really happy with who they are. Because ADHDers have such incredible qualities and strengths, particularly coming through so much adversity. But at the same time, I also want to be pushing the whole discussion on, we shouldn't have people masking. It's not
Mm,
necessary.
mm. Well,
And
as you say, it comes back down to environment. If the environment is correct, well, then there isn't a need for it to the extent that ADHDers need to. Um,
yeah,
and as we said, everybody conforms in some way to their environment, and that is fine. Neurotypical or a neurodivergent brain, there's always an element of that, and that is okay. But it's just the extent and the expectation on.
I think also that things, we have to the current generation. I think it's not just that things were the same when we were kids, because I have a suspicion that you and I spent a lot of our childhood running around outside, and um, you know, we didn't have phones. Well, certainly I certainly didn't have phones until I was of working age, a personal mobile phone, and certainly not a smartphone until, a later point. And, I laugh about the term crackberry because, I mean, for me, I think if we look back and saw one of the really obvious signs is that when I got a BlackBerry, it was absolute dopamine heaven for me. I mean, and suddenly, getting connected to the internet and being able to surf things on the internet, as it just my brain loves it. Like
Sure.
I can't get bored as long as I have a phone connection. So, and even then I won't get bored. But what I would say is that for kids growing up who are not exposed to as much manual and tactile and experiential play, I think this is definitely putting a strain on young brains, because we definitely know that play, for example, I've got really involved in sort of understanding play science. That it's not as healthy to have a smartphone for a young brain. And just that intensity, the screens, the focus, and also just not learning by doing and being out there and playing and getting your knees scraped and and learning all those conflict management skills that we learned as kids. It's just natural. So I
Mm.
think it is very different for today's youngsters and today's ADHDers. And I think definitely we're seeing a mental health impact from that,
We
as well
are,
as a learning
absolutely.
impact from that.
And what is the good thing that what we are seeing is that this increased awareness and almost an explosion in ADHD diagnosis, or people seeking diagnosis, which thankfully, while yes, on the one side, there is obviously a hell of a lot more of anxiety and recognized anxiety for all of the reasons you said. For our ADHDers and particularly for the girls, it is crucially important that we are getting that diagnosis in, because for many, they they may not be in environments as you were fortunate to be in. They may not be in environments unless by design. If they
Yeah,
do
well,
not understand their brain, and it's really getting that understanding of how the brain works. And at the moment, ADHD is still seen, so much that it's the disorder when in fact it's just a different wiring. It's, a different, just that nervous system and the different requirements that are there. So when we start to recognize, and I think it's important to start looking at, well, why have so many of our girls not been diagnosed to this point? And it's kind of, I think it lies at the heart of one of the reasons why they're not seen is because it is felt so differently, it's displayed and it's exhibited so differently. So for girls it's much more an internalized Whereas for
Yeah.
boys, it's more behavioral symptomatic, and they're more likely to be brought for diagnosis at a much earlier stage. So girls don't aren't getting the opportunity to be in the right environments, to even know what those right environments are, because it's not been
Well,
seen and they're
I
masking,
mean,
coping.
yeah, I think there are physiological parts to this, and there are also social norm
Mm,
parts to this. And I think
mm,
girls, the way that girls are used to conforming in society had something to do with certainly girls potentially masking much more successfully than boys. Boys, it was okay if you're hyperactive, it was okay to run around and
mm.
wreak havoc and in some social, if we just look at how boys and girls are socialized so differently, girls are given caring dolls and things to look after, and boys are given, boys' toys are all kind of weapons and things to
Yeah,
make havoc with. And I think that is part of an explanation. They do say that girls are more likely to be inattentive than the hyperactive part, but I think maybe over time we're going to discover that all of these diagnostic buckets and
yeah,
boxes are going to get moved and shifted, and even our understanding of autism and how autism and ADHD, it used to be that they were mutually exclusive, and now in fact they say it's 70% crossover in on one or other side, and therefore I think as our understanding of and sort of neuroscience is advancing, I think we're going to go through a massive change of our understanding. It's changing month by month. So
it is. You can
some of
see over the
it's
last,
yeah,
18 months, you can just see a marked change.
yeah,
And it's also been experienced in terms of the amount of people who are coming forward for diagnosis. And I think that difference there as well between boys and girls, the boys, yes, is stereotypical as jumping around the classroom, and the girls are expected perhaps not to be. I had one client who came, and we were chatting, and she said she remembers so distinctly in the classroom. She just wanted to get up and jump and run around, but she never did. She used to keep blue tack underneath her desk, and
mm,
she would just keep rolling and rolling her blue tack. And that was her way of I guess expending the energy, right? Of getting that energy out, but at
yeah,
the same time not appearing as though she was being disruptive, because that was the thing. Girls are not disruptive. The boys in the class could be, but the girls will not be. And so she said she was so aware and distracted by everything going on around her, but the only thing that anchored her was having this blue tack underneath.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
she went on to continue that, so that she remembers that when she was about 8 years of age. And so she continued in that way, that that masking became very much part of her and part of what she did. And that's, as part of this conversation around self-identity. What happens then for somebody like, this woman within coaching, that she reaches a point in her 30s, 40s, of where there's such a disconnect with herself as to who she is.
mm,
And there's very much this looking externally for validation, for what should I be doing? How should I be behaving? What should I be thinking? And that goes through, it fed through from college, what college courses she should take, to what jobs she should do. And again, it's back to environment, as you said, no longer having no awareness or her own self-awareness of what it is that would actually work for her. And instead carrying this really heavy burden of always feeling somewhat ashamed of the mess ups that she would make that nobody else seemed to make. And so hiding all of that, which would then lead into perfectionism. Those mess ups might be around being late and forgetting things and just not appearing together. So she spent so long just really focusing on, I need to look like I'm put together well.
yeah,
Just creates
absolutely.
this dreadful disconnect between herself and who she is, because it's all the time, it's external. And so that's one of the things that very much with coaching, it's about bringing that back in, that focus back on themselves, to start to understand their strengths, the environments, as you said, and starting not just to be focusing on, well, these are the strategies that you need to have for those areas of ADHD that you need support, but this is where you shine, right? This is where you can shine, and these are the amazing strengths. that, and the experiences that you have, as you talked about, the experiences that you have had can be very powerful and have brought you to where you are. So not looking back entirely negatively and framing it all negatively. There's so much that's learned and that you can bring forward with a new sense of self and self-awareness.
Yeah. I mean, I think finding yourself is the most important part. I mean, you do feel I see this kind of dichotomy between, people coming and saying I've got ADHD and I've made a big success of it versus people who many of the clients that have come to coaching because they've hit some kind of wall that is difficult to get past. And I think for me, the point is that it is the paradox. It's not either or, it's always both. I mean,
Mm.
I think,
Yeah.
we can knock the ball out of the park, but we can also be huge masters of disaster and bring things on ourselves that, well, we feel that we're bringing things on ourselves. And for me, that, it's just that I think I used to always joke about, like, it felt like life was like, I felt like I was living on a roller coaster. And, I think that is the reality. Our extremes are much, our spiky profiles, that they talk about, that we are kind of neurospicy, that we're going to have big highs and big lows. And, you know, the last thing we ever are is mediocre or somehow in the middle of
Mm,
the curve.
mm.
So
But with coaching, where that can be very powerful is, I guess, minimizing, minimizing those real dips, minimizing those lows. And I kind of term it very much, and it's about resetting, and being really strong at resetting. Um,
yeah,
and of course, there's dips in, and there's going to be mess ups that people will make. But it's about having that kindness, which is what we talked about before, of having kindness to yourself, kinder environments, that is embracing of different ways of doing things, um, and just,
yeah, because they keep saying, like, well, I think it's even for an ADHD, if you've got self-esteem issues, you feel like it's like an added burden when people are saying, like, you've got to feel confident, you got to be confident in yourself, and that to me is like, oh, not another thing that you're going to land on us. I was writing about this recently, but this thing about it, yes, we want our clients to believe in themselves, but I think believing in others, that's something that the world could do at no or low cost. That just being less selfish, I think, is something the world desperately needs. And it's not just about looking about you and yours, but I think with clients, you see how they blossom and grow and how they see their resources when they feel that glow of appreciation and acknowledgement and being heard and seen and understood. And so, we talk about the pressure to belong as if, like, being part of a tribe is important, but I think this whole discussion around diversity and inclusion is really where we need to be. Yet that takes us into conflictual areas as well, like, as if that has come out of fashion, and it's get that sort of being shut down because it's this whole thing of conflict. I think if we were there for if we valued each and every one of us for what we bring, and if we focused on strengths and not weaknesses, I think what we miss is that actually that makes people perform better, be less defensive,
well,
have
there's less
need to
need
mask. Yeah,
there's less need
yeah.
for just the extent of coping strategies that people who experience, um,
Mm,
environments that are harsher and less kind, and not intentionally so, not intentionally so, but nonetheless they can be. And so that's where we just see, where there is just so much room for growth in terms of that acceptance of ADHD, and all the other, from dyslexia and dyspraxia and all the other, great and wonderful ways that our brain works. building those environments through schools that start to identify much earlier, not just looking for the rowdy little boy who's running around and sitting in that stereotype, but just looking more broadly to our girls and boys who may be inattentives also who can be missed. So it's really broadening just our whole understanding within our school systems, within our universities, not just talking the talk, because I still feel there's a lot of that. You know, universities, our education, our whole education system really needs to look at this much more broadly. Um, and then within workplaces as well, there's just so much room for growth and accepting all of those differences. So I feel we could sit and talk for hours on this. So I think, thank you so much, Susan, for sharing. It is, I think your story is a really remarkable story of how ADHD can thrive, whether you know you have it or not, but where the environments are right. The downsides are absolutely there and very much lived and experienced. And you talked about that in terms of just people pleasing and overworking and all of, taking on more than when necessary, than you should. And these are all coping strategies that we put in place. But the right environments and the knowledge and the self-acceptance of ADHD can really help people to thrive and just to be themselves and not have all these coping strategies. So that's really that is the goal. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on this LinkedIn Live session. I hope you found it interesting, intriguing. As Susan said, she is never ever bored, and I can promise you never boring. So there's always so much to discuss. Thank you for joining us. We still have some more topics. For the rest of the week as part of the ADHD Empowerment Month with the ADHD Advocate. So remember, if you have comments, questions, please do leave them in the comment section. And then on November 1st, we will be doing takeouts from all of the various sessions. So that will be great. And of course, we look forward to chatting again at some future time, Susan. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.